Welcome to Security Disruptors. The center of gravity in global politics has been shifting towards the Indo-Pacific for more than a decade, and developments in both American and Chinese politics suggest that shift will accelerate, says Kim Richard Nozzle in the Martello Papers published at Queen's University in 2024. The Indo-Pacific is a vast region spanning from the Indian Ocean to the western shores of the Pacific. It's widely viewed as the new center of global economic dynamism, and it accounts for over half of the world's GDP. The current conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran highlights the interconnectedness of North America, the Persian Gulf, and the Indo-Pacific, and China in particular. Shift east to the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, and the same issues are in play. China's expansionist growth in the South China Seas, its goal of repatriating Taiwan, all threaten global trade. Move up the Asian coast to North Korea and its nuclear aspirations, and then add in non-traditional threats like state-sponsored cyber espionage and transnational crime. And not to overlook the strategic value of Palau, the Solomon Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia. It's time to turn our full attention to the most important security theater in the world, the Indo-Pacific. It is where the focus must and will be. But this is not new. It's something that has not been paid close attention to in North America, and it's not attributed to Trump. It goes back to the Obama administration when then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton declared the Pacific Century in 2011. She said at the time, it's time to pivot to Asia, recognizing the region is one of the most important tasks for American statecraft. We have a great panel this morning on Security Disruptors. Now, for those of you who are watching and would like to send a question, please go to slido.com, use the login hashtag security and send us your questions, and we'll share those with the panelists as we go. Our panelists are Cleo Paskal, a non-resident senior fellow at the Federation for Defense of Democracies. Dr. Stephen Nagy, the professor of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian School in Tokyo. Richard Ivey, a retired Canadian Armed Force intelligence professional, and my co-host Calvin Chrustie of the Critical Risk Team. Cleo, I'd like to start with you because you right now are in Taiwan. From your perspective, looking out towards North America, are we paying enough attention to what is happening in the Indo-Pacific as a strategic and defense from a strategic and defense perspective?
Good evening from here in Taipei, and thank you for having me on. Always a pleasure to be on a show where you do so much background research beforehand, so we can get right into the meaty stuff. You started with the Clinton administration. I'm going to go back to at least the Spanish-American War to talk about how important this region is.
Right.
Yeah. So, and it's relevant particularly because President Trump is a fan of President McKinley, not just because of the tariffs, but also, when McKinley launched the Spanish-American War and took the Philippines and Guam, he was very explicit about saying the two main reasons were they needed a place to refit the U.S. Navy on that side of the globe, so in the Western Pacific, in part because they needed to be there because of trade. And the other reason was because there was a concern that the Spanish, if they maintained control in that area, would hit, and he specifically identified the Oregon and California coasts, and these were relatively new parts of the United States. So for at least 100 and, let's see if my math is any good, 28 years, there's been an acknowledgement at the highest level in the Oval Office that the whole Pacific, the Western Pacific, all the way through the Central Pacific, is critical for American prosperity and security. And that's why, if you take a look at the map of the U.S., the easternmost point is the U.S. Virgin Islands. The southernmost point is American Samoa. The northernmost point is Alaska, which is very much a part of the Indo-Pacific. The westernmost point is Guam and CNMI. So if you're in Guam, you're only 1,700 miles away from Taiwan, about the distance from Chicago to LA. The U.S. is very much in the Pacific and on the strategic front line, and it's not accidental. It's a byproduct of those strategic decisions that are tied to economic expansion, dating back well over a century, and it's also part of Canadian history as part of the kind of U.S. quest to the Pacific. Of course, the U.S. bought Alaska, and the goal was to make a move on the region that you're in, and to squeeze the British colonies into for the U.S. to grab the entire West Coast. And it was those colonies only joined because Canada built what had confederated in the East agreed to build the transcontinental railway to get Canadian troops to be able to defend the west coast of Canada. So we sort of have forgotten a little bit about how important this region is for defense and security to the entire continent, but it was very much part of the shaping, not just of the U.S. physically, geographically, but also the birth of Canada.
You know, so since the Spanish-American War, the next threat into the Pacific, of course, was the Japanese Empire, and that produced an enormous struggle, of course, between Japan and the United States, with the United States eventually winning that, and Japan and the United States then forming an alliance. Stephen, how important is this alliance when it comes to Indo-Pacific security between the United States and Japan today, despite the fact that they had been bitter enemies during the Second World War?
Well, they're not bitter enemies at all anymore, Stuart. Today, They have a comprehensive alliance. And I would like to put that into context. The Japanese send their top diplomats to American Ivy League schools so that they build those lifetime networks of how they can visualize and understand the strategic challenges facing the region. It's a defense technology partnership in which they start to jointly invest in and develop the new technologies that are important for dealing with the challenges within the region. And they look at the broader region, not just in terms of China, but they look at weapons proliferation on the Korean Peninsula. They look at the collaboration between the Russians and North Koreans in terms of launch vehicles and re-entry technologies. They look at the importance of sea lines of communication through the Taiwan Strait and into the South China Sea, into the Indian Ocean, and how these will potentially be weaponized by states within the region, and the technologies that are going to be used to prevent conflict from emerging. So it's a comprehensive partnership that is not only a military alliance, it's an economic partnership, it's a technological partnership. And most recently, if you followed the meeting between Prime Minister Takichi and President Trump on October 29th, 2025, they made a major announcement about investing in the mining of rare earth materials, but also the processing of those rare earth materials so that they can escape the choke point that China has developed on rare earth materials, so they can continue to use those rare earth materials for their economies, for their military and security development. And again, providing a broader security partnership that is interweaved with a trilateral partnership between the Australians, the Americans, and the Japanese. It's interweaved with the quadrilateral security dialogue that includes India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. But more and more, we're also seeing that this U.S.-Japan partnership being really the basis for how the United States engages in the broader region, tries to balance China's rise in a way that we can continue to benefit from China's economic size, but also defend ourselves against the challenges of an authoritarian state that really has a track record of foreign interference, of gray zone operations, lawful operations, and a real interest in reshaping international institutions so that they are more friendly to other authoritarian states like China.
Yeah, in reading your report about the issues that middle powers need to address and be aware of and come up with a strategy to deal with U.S.-China competition, is very interesting to see how important it is that all of these middle powers, Japan, the United States, or Canada and Australia in particular, need to employ to make sure that they can maintain relationships with both powers, not alienate themselves and not be too aligned with one or over the other. It's a very delicate balance that we're in right now.
There's a metaphor that the East Asians use, and it's, when the elephants are playing in the grass, it's the mice that get trampled. So middle powers like Canada or Australia, Japan, even India is still a relatively, in terms of its behavior, a middle power. They're worried about what's going to happen between the United States and China. Will they make some deal that some G20 partnership that really reshapes the entire region in ways that maybe suit China and the United States, but don't suit the interests of Canada, Australia, or other middle powers? So we are trying, as we conceptualize how to engage as a middle power with these two states, we're trying to conceptualize it through a wording that I use, hardened engagement, where we continue to engage with these states. We try to be indispensable partners to our most important partner, the United States, by far. But at the same time, we try to engage with China to a certain degree with real clear eyes. And real clear eyes means a clear understanding of foreign interference, the use of United Front Work Department in destabilizing our societies and democracies, and destabilizing our reputation with our other partners, whether it's the Five Eye partners or whether it's other partners like Japan or South Korea or Southeast Asian countries. So middle powers have a challenge. We need to maintain our economic growth and prosperity. We need to maintain that incredibly pivotal and most important partnership with the United States. But we also have to balance the changes in the international order going forward and the United States' efforts to try and tackle, I think, the most comprehensive, demanding, and challenging competitor to the United States ever, and that's China, because it's a comprehensive power that is comprehensively powerful in all elements of economic statecraft.
Yeah, China is a true superpower along with the United States. Calvin.
Thanks, Stu. Richard, for yourself, long-term service in the Canadian military, in the intelligence field, obviously significant insights. I just wonder what your perspective is when we talk about this new, not this new theater, obviously an old theater, but from a NATO perspective, a Canadian perspective, a North American perspective, looking at our partners and our allies, Five Eyes and NATO. Does NATO itself truly understand the significance of this theater of operation, these threat activities, and the threat actors that are currently active there? As we look at the headlines, many of them still focused on Russia. I even see within Canada lots of stuff relative to misinformation, disinformation from Russia, and a heavy focus on Russia. But is this something that there's potentially a gap in terms of understanding and prioritization relative to this area of conflict and threat activity?
Well, my first recollection of solid reporting on this type of activity by China started in like 2004, reading reports by our intelligence agency. Then the entire Middle East and Afghanistan kicked off, and we became so focused on that. When I first arrived in China in 2010 as the defense attaché's assistant and the intelligence advisor, I watched how this was happening in China and how it was impacting the rest of the region, as well as Canada and the United States. And it was building up its military rapidly. They were putting in a capital ship almost every month. I remember telling Ottawa that this is a significant thing and we should probably put some focus here. And I was told that it wasn't important at the time. As we moved forward, I saw that was some attention being given to China and what was happening with all these efforts. It started, and then as you said, the whole Russia thing popped up, and it just seemed like they just shoved it off to the side because it was something that they knew, regardless if Russia was now a democracy. But it was something that they knew, and perhaps a lot of these old Cold War warriors, myself included, felt that was an easier task to broach.
And do you think that NATO and our allies truly understand, as particularly the Americans have vocalized, Richard, in recent times, and we're seeing in the headlines, almost every week, the threat activities from that region, where American entities are making arrests of Chinese spies, concern regarding the economic coercion and subversion of North America. Do you think NATO understands that perhaps the delay in responding to this area is having the significant impact as it is? Do you think your former cohorts in NATO, in terms of intelligence and that, understand that North America is also under threat currently?
Sort of a yes and no answer. I think there are people within NATO, Canada, United States, as well as the UK, pretty much strong actors in sort of identifying and trying to counter this effort. But I think we're playing catch up. The Chinese have been conducting these activities for a long time, excuse me. But I think they're ill prepared. I think we've been preparing for a sort of expeditionary kind of warfare and the like, and anything associated with that. But this newer type of conflict that China is bringing to the table, be it electronic, be it it's subversive gray zone activities, is on our heels.
Well, that brings up an interesting point. Cleo, in the report that you wrote a couple of years ago about the shifting dynamic in the Asia, Indo-Pacific area, you specifically talked of the use of gray zone warfare. Give us a perspective on how that is playing itself out in places like the Solomon Islands or Palau or the Federated States of Micronesia, and why we need to be paying attention to this.
Yes, thank you. So I'll use Palau as an example. Palau is just to the east of the Philippines. And it's one of three countries that are in free association with the U.S. So these are independent countries. You talked about the Japanese Empire in the Pacific. There was something between the Spanish and the Japanese, which was the Germans. So the U.S., after the end of the Spanish-American War, took the Philippines and Guam. The other Spanish possessions were sold by Spain to Germany. Germany lost them to Japan in World War I. So from 1914 until they were dislodged 30 years later, the Japanese set up in the center of the Pacific from the edge of the Philippines all the way almost to Hawaii, an area that's about 80% of the size of the continental United States, and blocked the center of the Pacific. And that's why the U.S. had to go down through Guadalcanal and then come back up across. And the last sort of one, the one furthest to the west is Palau, where the Battle of Peleliu was fought. To cut to the end here, they became independent countries. Three of them became independent countries, including Palau. And Palau is a country that recognizes Taiwan, and it's in free association with the U.S. So these three countries were deemed so strategically important to the U.S. that the U.S. offered them to join the U.S. And part of the area, which is the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, did join the U.S. The other three went independent and signed these compacts of free association with the U.S. The people of these countries, the Palauans, independent country, can freely live and work in the U.S. and serve in the U.S. military, as can those from Federated States of Micronesia and Marshall Islands. These are relationships like nothing else the U.S. has. And the reason is because they're so strategically important. The U.S. has, as part of the compacts, strategic denial and can base to a certain degree in these areas. And they are setting up over-the-horizon radar installation in Palau, and the Marines are rebuilding the runway in Peleliu. So just to give an idea, first of all, you may not have heard of it, many people haven't, but it is a country that looms very large in China's calculations because, first of all, it recognizes Taiwan. Second of all, it's in free association with the U.S. Third, it's right tucked behind the Philippines, so it can be a big problem for China. So a country of 18,000 people, that's it, 18,000. And it's a very clear example of how China uses unrestricted warfare to try to destabilize a country in order to pull it into its orbit. The first phase involved turbo jumping tourism. So the Chinese went from almost no tourists in about 2010 to over 50% of the tourists going to Palau by 2015, 2016 were Chinese. It massively inflated the economy. And then the Chinese pulled all the tourists at once and said they're not coming back unless you de-recognize Taiwan. So the Palauans who they had gone into business with, who were, in the hotel sectors and things like that, were supposed to, according to sort of the way the Chinese operate, be the ones to apply pressure to their own government to de-recognize Taiwan for their own economic security. The Palauans withstood the pressure. And so the second phase began around 2016, which is when the Chinese operatives started pushing in high-level organized crime, including people like Broken Tooth, who are very serious triad operatives, buying land around the military bases, but also, the scam organizations, prostitution, drugs, all sorts of things to create what the Chinese call disintegration warfare, to corrode it from the inside. We've now just entered the third phase, or the most recent phase, which is the Chinese are now offering the Palauan authorities, they're saying, look, you got a problem with Chinese organized crime, but we can help you with it. So why don't you send your security officials here to Hong Kong, and we'll work with you on solving this Chinese organized crime problem. The Palauans have said no, and they'll be hosting the Pacific Island Forum meeting in the spring, in the late summer, early fall. And now the Chinese are saying, well, we'll send our security officials first, early, to the PIF, to the Pacific Island Forum meeting to help you handle this problem. So the arsonists are trying to pretend that they're firefighters. The point is, over the course of all of this, incredibly disruptive. Families get broken up, politics get distorted, media gets co-opted. It can be quite overwhelming. And this is a very consistent playbook across the region.
Well, one of the other elements is bribery as well, is it not?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, that's such a embedded part of it. I forgot to mention it. I mean, the entry point is corruption, and is the strategic corruption. So that if you don't go after the corruption, nothing else is going to work. And in fact, the U.S. has designated, the State Department has designated the current president of the Senate of Palau for taking Chinese money. That means he and his family can no longer travel to the U.S. Now, they didn't deliver a package to the Attorney General of Palau that would allow her to prosecute him. So he's still in place. And this goes to how do you fight this, and the cognitive warfare component of it. And what would have been helpful was if there had been an actual prosecution with evidence shown, then you could have taken him out. But now that they didn't pursue him like that, they just designated him, he can say he's being targeted for standing up for Palau, and the U.S. is a big bully, and he has managed to flip the narrative on the U.S. to a certain degree. So the cognitive warfare domain is highly relevant for this as well, because not only you can get a real win, but it becomes an actual loss if you don't manage the cognitive environment, which is currently heavily manipulated by the Chinese Communist Party through United Front operations and social media manipulation, all that other stuff as well.
So that's one tool that the government of China is using. Stephen, they also have fully embraced the idea of discourse power. Explain to our audience why it's so important that we understand the use of discourse power and how embedded it is into the strategy coming out of Beijing.
Well, when we look at this idea of discourse power, it's basically to try and control a narrative about things such as what is democracy, what is human rights, what is development, what is rule of law. And they tend to try to create a rather relativistic understanding of all these different kinds of concepts. The Deconi China dictionary out of Merrick's does a great job of breaking down these ideas. But China is very much interested in eroding away how we've traditionally thought about these concepts. And traditionally works with the global South, who already have some suspicions about these ideas as being, platforms to recolonize in one way or the other the global South countries. We used to call the developing countries or third world countries. So when, let's say, Canada comes into Southeast Asia and it's talking and linking human rights and democracy promotion and, let's say, gender equality in Southeast Asia, China will send a message to the countries saying that this is a kind of neo-colonialism and that this region has a particular right to develop along its democracy, its rule of law, its understanding of concepts in ways that are consistent with their culture. And it sounds really good. It sounds actually, I think, something that most of us would believe in. But what China is trying to do is really erode away, I think, traditional understandings of these concepts, in particular in international institutions, so that these international institutions can no longer be accountable for behavior that it would be seen as inconsistent with concepts of rule of law, concepts such as democracy, concepts such as human rights. So this is a very important aspect, I think, of how China engages in its broader diplomacy. And the latest version, we saw this with the Trump-Xi summit in Beijing last week, is China tried to offer a new framing of the US-China relationship that was based on a form of strategic management to try and stabilize its relationship. And by throwing that out there, whether the Americans agreed with it or not, they're trying to create the narrative that if the United States changes its position globally, that it was the United States that has fundamentally shifted away from an agreement between the Chinese and the Americans. And this shows that the United States is not a partner that can be relied on. And this is, again, part of the discourse power that China is promoting to show that it's a stable, reliable partner, and countries like the United States aren't.
Yeah. Calvin?
Richard, I have the opportunity to ask you another question. When we look at the formal and informal alliances and NATO, i.e. Canada, US in this region, then Five Eyes, Canada, US, Australia, and New Zealand, and our informal relationships and security pacts that are inclusive of our allies such as Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, etc. Effectively, how effective are we right now in terms of preparing for this theater? How well positioned are we currently in light of the current threat activities and the intelligence reports, in the South China Sea, the tensions between US, China, and other entities? And is there anything that both formally and informally these security pacts need to do more effectively? So first, how effective are we currently, and what do we need to do more effectively?
Are we effective? Yes, but not completely. I think we need better intelligence sharing. My experience in Beijing, especially when we would have our biweekly Five Eyes meetings, we would also arrange to have secondary meetings with Japan. Japan got sort of drawn into this, and I know the Americans negotiated intelligence sharing with them. I did see some reporting from Japan, but the work that we need to do has to be pretty in depth, and we have to trust one another a little bit more. We saw occasions where Canada was not exactly included some of this information sharing, and that hopefully led us to be less informed than perhaps the UK and the Americans were in the region. I did my to work with my counterparts in the country at the time. I did notice that it was a sort of a bit of a picking up in the level of sharing and intercommunication between in the Five Eyes community.
Could I just ask a tail question on that? And it goes back to Cleo and Stephen's comments regarding the cognitive issue. In terms of creating that more murky kind of narrative and priorities, et cetera, I mean, Canada has come out in recent time in terms of going, hey, new strategic partner, China. Others are very engaged in terms of trade activity with China. How does that confuse or undermine the security alliances in that region to prepare for the threat activities that are taking place? Like that, is it undermining or is it contributing to China's cognitive, warfare narrative in this particular region?
We've taken the bait from them already. Is you'll get sort of conflicting reporting in the media and in government briefs where there's a desire to engage in additional trade and which is good for everyone's economy. But they also say, China is a rising power and poses a significant threat to the Asia-Pacific region.
So we're talking about the Indo-Pacific this morning. We've focused much on the South Pacific right now. India is clearly coming more and more into the theater economically and militarily. How important is it that we, from a North American perspective, are paying attention to fostering those relationships? I know that in Vancouver, just yesterday, 150 business people from India are here looking to develop economic ties between Canada and the United States, or Canada and India. How important is the development of those relationships with India so that we can have a more secure, comprehensive relationship and greater security in the Indo-Pacific? Cleo, I'll start with you, and then Stephen, I'd like to come to you on the same topic.
Sure, it's extremely important. Secretary Rubio, who is also National Security Advisor, Rubio is just in India, and they had a Quad leaders meeting, made a bunch of announcements. The Trump 2.0 administration got off to a rocky start with India, but Sergio Gore was appointed as ambassador. He ran the presidential personnel office under Trump 2.0, so he could have picked pretty much any job he wanted, and that's the job that he picked. So that means that they have a very high-profile ambassador who can get the president on the phone anytime he wants, and which in fact he did at an event just the other day. Got the president on speakerphone in front of the group. So the U.S. During the tariff phase initially was not helpful. There's some really vitriolic rhetoric online, and I kind of wonder how much of it is organic and how much of it is fueled, especially by the Russians and the French, actually, who want to preserve their relationship with India, not have to compete with the U.S. to a certain degree, but particularly by Chinese bots, because if India and the U.S. come together, China has a real problem. And I inadvertently triggered that when, if you remember, there was the discussion of the Thucydides trap. Chairman Xi was trying to bring up the Thucydides trap paradigm when President Trump was there, and I made a statement about how whenever China tries to pull one of these narrative framing things, I always run the India test. If you replace the word China with the word India, which is also a country of 1 billion people that has a growth rate actually that is larger than China's, and is unlike China, democratic and pluralistic. It's not perfect, obviously, but does it hold true? So China's argument is it's normal that we're building this massive navy designed to destroy the U.S. because Thucydides trap, rising powers will just do that naturally. Well, India's not doing it. So no, this was a choice. And when I posted that online, it got way more views than normal, and the responses, including in the comments, were very 50 Cent Army-ish, which means it struck a nerve. And a lot of it was about a lot of the vitriolic comments were about trying to make it look like certain sectors, particularly MAGA was very racist against India. Now, there may be elements of that that have tied into the H-1B visa issue, but this was not, you could tell based on the sort of when accounts were created and things like that, that's actually not what the majority of this was. So by the reaction of the Chinese operation to things like that, that tells you how important it is to maintain and to foster and to ultimately to grow.
Calvin.
Yeah, quick question on this, because we've talked about China throughout this conversation significantly. But when we look at other parts of the world, whether it be Africa, the Middle East, the Russia dispute, we often look at, hey, what's the role of China, in terms of supporting some of these other entities? So going back to CRINCS, the acronym for China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. In this space, we haven't talked that much relative to a Russian presence, an Iranian presence, or the North Korean role in this particular area. And I just wonder, I'll direct this to Cleo first, Richard second, in terms of what's the role of China's other partners in this region from a security perspective: Russia, Iran, North Korea?
Yeah, so there's a lot of Chinese fueling of others to create problems. So, of course, we've seen it as particularly with Iran, where China is providing things like missile fuel and component parts and things like that to try to keep it going. And same with the support for Russia in Iran. They're bleeding out the U.S. and the U.S. has been, they're talking about how the Secretary of the Navy has talked about how there's a pause on weapons deliveries to Taiwan, but actually what he was saying was there's a pause on all weapons deliveries because they don't know how much they're going to need for Iran. Now that's not great. It's an effective bleeding out and distraction. And I think I also think online, because I've been looking quite closely as much as I can at this cognitive warfare stuff. I think a lot of the really kind of vitriolic anti-Semitism that's coming in online is serving to be a distraction to to effective Chinese operations. So if you're, blaming Israel for all your problems, you're not looking at all of the problems being caused by China, for example. And at the same time, you're advancing this disintegration warfare that we've seen on a smaller scale, the domestic polarization and things like that in places like Palau, as I've described. So I think it's pretty toxic, and we've seen other occasions in the past where China has attacked when major powers have been doing something different. So during the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, that was when China attacked India in 1962. And as the Cuban Missile Crisis resolved, China pulled back. So the idea that, we have case studies of when China uses problems elsewhere to advance its own interests when the big powers are weakened. So it's and I think that's at least one component of what's going on now too.
Richard, in terms of Russia, Iran, North Korea operating in this theater, what have we seen historically and currently that we should be paying attention to as it relates to those other entities supporting or partnering or running their own independent foreign influence operations in the region?
I just said influence operations. That is something that's been ongoing collaboratively and independently for a while. But what I've sort of seen is that China is now sort of taking a more leader role, where Russia used to be considered the top, and everyone sort of followed along or partnered with. But a lot of these partners now are starting to look more like proxies where you have North Korea and Iran running operations, the IO campaigns online with these factories of spreading anti-Semitism, spreading anti-Western hate, or saying that the West is racist against China when they never put the mirror back on themselves. But just Russia is not as strong in the region, whereas China is, but it can, because they're now dependent on China for things like weapons and component parts. Same thing with North Korea. China is basically got them under wraps and in control now, but for how long? And Iran, we're sort of buried deep with their current conflict with the United States. So,
So, Stephen, I actually want to shift the conversation a little bit to the use of economic coercion and what role India can play, but also when we take a look at alliances like the Quad or AUKUS, how important is it that especially middle powers working with the United States in some way form alliances that can help to bolster some of these smaller countries in their ability to deal with economic coercion coming from China? But also, let's recognize that they can also be victims of economic coercion from the United States.
Absolutely. So I think traditionally what we've seen is that the United States has not been a country that is engaged in economic coercion. Under the Trump administration and Liberation Day in particular, many countries have felt that the United States has used their economic size to coerce countries into some kind of unfair trading compromise. While this may be true in some cases, I think in generally it's more about equalizing trade relationships so that the United States could get its economy back on track, reindustrialize and create a stronger, more competitive United States and North American and allied economic groups so they can better compete with China. China, though, has a longer track record of economic coercion. Ask the Australians, ask the Lithuanians, ask the South Koreans, ask the Vietnamese, ask the Canadians, of course, and ask the Japanese, and they'll all tell you that economic coercion, the weaponization of supply chains, rare earth supply chains, other kinds of supply chains is something that they've all faced when there was a political disagreement. So how do we get around this? And this is a very difficult question because I don't think we can get away from this by excluding the United States. We have to work with the United States in terms of some kind of coalition to try and build a new economy, build new supply chains. And this is not something that's going to take a week or 2 weeks. It takes maybe a decade or longer to reconfigure supply chains. And this is something that we have to go and sit on the table. So you asked, how does India fit in here? How does the Quad fit in here? And I think we've seen some good examples emerge from Japan. Japan has faced economic coercion from China for decades. And it's invested heavily in Southeast Asia and India in terms of building infrastructure and connectivity, investing in new production networks, building new partnerships, and pulling India into different minilateral relationships like the Quad. The view is, from Japan's point of view, is that you create new economic hubs that are largely aligned with how Japan sees the region. That means an international order based on rule of law. And that you could pull the center of gravity away from China, and that gives you more strategic autonomy. So this is, I think, how India fits into your question. Is India is going to be a major hub that pulls the center of gravity away from China and makes those tools of coercion, whether it's weaponization of rare earth materials, other supply chains such as pharmaceuticals, make it much more difficult to deploy on smaller and middle-sized countries. And if we can do this effectively with India within the Quad framework or other minilateral frameworks, I think that we can offer the United States something important in terms of their broad competition with China over the coming decades, but we can also do something for other middle powers like ourselves, and that stabilize their economy, give them more strategic autonomy, and help them be really more insulated from some of the weaponization of supply chains that we've seen from China. And that must include India, must include Southeast Asia, but those minilaterals like the Quad and others that are emerging.
So what are the lessons that we've learned from the way Australia responded to economic coercion from China post their inquiry about the origins of COVID? China reacted swiftly. Coal, beef, wine. What did the Australians do that other middle powers and even the United States, not that they're subject in the same manner, but that we can learn from that Australian experience?
Well, they started to diversify towards Southeast Asia and India in terms of iron ore exports, but also agricultural exports. And I think that was really important. But it was Australia's long-term relationships with Taiwan, with Japan, with South Korea, with other countries that allowed them to import or export their products to those markets as well. And you had prominent ambassadors and politicians saying, "Please drink Australian wine." They have been supportive of our foreign policy and our engagement. So it's not only what Australia did at the moment after China imposed export restrictions on Australia after asking for a COVID inspection, but it was the decades of strong partnership with Japan, with Southeast Asian countries, with India, that those countries said we need to help Australia at this particular time. And I think this is where Canada needs to be thinking, how can we do something similar, invest in those strong partnerships with South Korea, with Japan, with Taiwan, with Southeast Asian countries, India, etc., and ultimately, most importantly, the United States, so that when we face that weaponization of supply chains, that our partners will naturally come to us and say, you know what, we're on the same team. We're going to help you by opening up our markets and to relieve these pressures that are coming out of China or whatever countries engaged in economic coercion.
So, Richard, when we take a look at the Quad and especially the Australia, UK, US AUKUS agreement, how important is it that other powers are aligning with these groups, the Quad and AUKUS, to ensure that we're playing a role in strategic and military defense?
I mean, the AUKUS was sort of born at the same time that submarine deal happened, and I think places like South Korea that have a great military-industrial complex, and I think Canada's even considering buying submarines from them. The fact that countries in the region are recognizing these alliances are a benefit to them, or for their other strategic security issues or potential shift in trade. So I think they're important in the sense that they've identified the historical strength of these nations as well as what in the future things that they can offer.
So I'd like to get some closing thoughts from each of you about what are the 2 or 3 most important issues that you think are on the table here in the next 12 months that we need to be highly aware of, and steps that we need to take to address them as far as security in the entire Indo-Pacific region. Cleo, I'll start with you.
Sure. So just to go back for a minute to the UK and Australia, I don't think that they're nearly as strong as holding up for democratic values and all the things that we say they are as they might appear. So, for example, we got very close with the UK to the British just handing over the Chagos Archipelago to Mauritius. That's an archipelago that includes one of the most critical U.S. bases in the Indian Ocean. And had that gone through, there were lawsuits that would have been waiting to try to tie up that base. And even though Trump administration wouldn't have given it up, it's possible another U.S. administration would have. It was a strategic. It was a move that would have made the giving up of Bagram Air Base look like something unimportant, and that was sabotage by the UK. And it's worth remembering that this UK government is the same one that is allowing a massive Chinese embassy to go up very close to the cables that are going into the city. So I think we have to really take a very and as for the Australians, Albanese went to China and kowtowed to get them to buy his lobsters again, and they have not gone after the corruption that is running through Australia. The Chinese might give money to the Solomon Islanders, but in some cases they're laundering it through Australian bank accounts and real estates, and the Australians are doing nothing about it. So I think that we really need to go past the press releases and take a look at actions on the ground and see who is reinforcing security, because over the next year there's likely to be some changes and stress tests to the system. And a good starting point, a good beginning test is to see, are you going after, and this goes for Canada as well, are you going after Chinese-linked, which is corruption, which is strategic corruption that's designed to undermine your ability to craft independent foreign policy and to respond in a way that is responsible to the citizens who voted you into power in the first place. So if people are going after corruption because we know it's there, then we're in good shape. And if they're not, then we really have to keep our head on a swivel, because you don't know what direction problems are going to come from.
Well, I know that you've brought this up before, where you're saying one of the tools that we have to, security tools, is that we just investigate corruption in individual countries where democratic values need to be protected.
Yes, and I think Calvin can speak to the situation in Canada better than I can. I mean, this is a problem that we have as well. We'll see whether our equivalent of the FAR regulations go through, and whether legislation is written in such a way so that we can actually start to get after some of this. But just look at what came out in the Cullen Commission report. We are very heavily infiltrated as a country, and we recognized China in 1970, and it's been decades in the making. So yeah, and we are an Indo-Pacific power, or we could be. But the reason we're not, maybe, is possibly because of some of this distortion of our foreign policy. So yes, we can criticize everybody else, and I do, but I think it's also fair to say we need to start taking a pretty strong look at what's going on within our own country.
So thanks for addressing those issues about the UK and Australia and so on. But what are the one or two most pressing issues that you'd like to see addressed in the Indo-Pacific region in the coming year?
So we need, from a hardcore military perspective, shipbuilding needs to start to happen very quickly. And that's, in the US, but also in Canada, there are just not enough ships. Intelligence sharing, as mentioned, with trusted partners, maybe beyond the Five Eyes in certain specific areas. Niche technologies shared with like-minded partners. Canada has been helping with dark vessel identification systems with the Philippines, for example. I know Palau would like to get a hold of that. Japan is very good at minesweeping, but for some reason they're not in the Strait of Hormuz. I don't know why. So a better identification of, while we're building up redundant capabilities, better identification of niche capabilities, and encouraging partners to deploy them for the sake of common security, and to raise the cost to China, so that they don't make a move, so that we show that we are ready, willing, and increasingly coordinated in the fight, not just political warfare, which is the corruption piece of it, but also the kinetic warfare, which is what I'm talking about now, and show that we're serious. And then ideally that would deter, so that we don't end up with a situation like we had before, where you have a battle like the Battle of Peleliu, which is not. I'm sitting in Taiwan. It's not inconceivable, but it is avoidable if we show some will and backbone and clarity about what we're facing.
Stephen, your thoughts, especially, how do we find an opportunity to be able to align ourselves across both superpowers and work together to be able to keep trade routes open and also to stay below the threshold of kinetic war?
So my first point, and I keep saying this, and I'll get vilified, I think, in Canada, but we have to fix things with the U.S. There's no Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy. There's no Canadian economy without having the most strong, closest, and indispensable partnership with the United States. That could be through trade agreements. It should be through technologies such as AI development or quantum computing development, sharing intelligence, dealing with foreign interference. We must have the strongest, important relationship with the United States. Secondly, and I think we should be really thinking about the possibility of a multiple contingency. And there's a great book for your readers. It's called "What If Russia Wins" by Carlo Massala, and he paints this stunning picture in 4 or 5 years, where Russia sends some tourists into the Baltics, and the Chinese engage in some kind of operations in the South China Sea to distract the United States. The Russians engage in some kind of destabilization of Northern Africa to get migrants into Southern Europe to distract the Europeans, and the Canadians and the Scandinavian states are distracted with Russia's sending submarines into the Arctic. The idea is that Russia and China thinks about things and how they can cooperate with other members to destabilize alliance partnerships and create the kind of contingency where we can't deal with all the problems simultaneously. And I think that we really need to start investing in thinking about these scenarios and how we can ensure that we are focused on the primary zones of conflict, which I do think is across the Taiwan Strait and in the South China Sea and perhaps on the Korean Peninsula. Keep our focus there, but do it with the United States and other reliable partners like Japan, South Korea, Australia.
Richard, from your perspective, from a security point of view, what would you like to see addressed here in the next year?
I think that our ability to operate in the Pacific region, especially militarily, and I'm going to echo what Cleo said, is our ability to ships. You're not crossing those thousands of kilometers of water without ships. And we're just not doing it. China has become, I would say, the largest navy in the world, and their ability to go beyond the second island chain has now been proven. They're able to sustain operations out in the Pacific Ocean. They go and off the coast of Hawaii and say hello all the time. They are off the coast of all the South Pacific Islands, doing less than honorable things. Some of the research vessels are actually conducting mining for like polymetallic nodules and stuff like that. But if we don't address the potential military conflict that would happen in Taiwan, and if Taiwan fell, that would just destabilize the entire region. I think that's one of our key issues. We have to address that elephant in the room. Is we're not capable of operating alone as Canadians. I mean, we send one ship occasionally in the region on tours of ports, or a patrol vessel for UN sanction enforcement, and occasionally a submarine, when it's operational, will go and float in the area. So I think if we don't partner with the United States, if we don't increase some extent procurement and fix the procurement problem in Canada, I mean, it should not take 10 years to say, okay, we're going to buy this ship, and then another 5 to 10 years to build them. We need to get realistic and say, if we need ships now, where can we get them quickly? And right now, that would be either South Korea or the Netherlands. I mean, they have an entire navy that's based on, it's like their showroom on the sea. Same with Korea. They can produce ships quickly, and they're relatively good ships. I don't know, I can't speak to them, but I think we need to address the short-term problems and also look forward to what the long-term problems are and how we can partner as the Pacific countries, Canada, United States, and even Mexico, in defending our side of the water.
Calvin, closing thoughts from you?
I think, reflecting on all the comments and reflecting on other shows and that, I think what I'm left with is probably the concern that although the kinetic and the military solutions are critical, as just discussed, I think what I'm most concerned about still I think, whether it be Canada, the US, our allies, is that all society involvement. And Stu, you mentioned, about the meetings with India here in terms of the business community. And I appreciate there's lots of photo ops, between governments with private partnerships in terms of economic security and national security, et cetera. But I really, really think that more now than ever, the pressure is on the private sector, the corporations, the business leaders, to ensure that their strategies, their trade focus is aligned with our economic security, our national security issues. And I think, some of that cognitive narrative that, all the participants discussed about today, I think governments really need to be very clear who's the threat and who's the ally, because I think the business community is probably a little concerned in terms of what's the way forward. I know I am as a Canadian. And I think, the private sector has to step forward, because I think the solutions in terms of these security threats in the Indo-Pacific are going to be dependent largely on the business community, on the private sector, the leadership within those, the CEOs, the private equity firms, and going, hey, how are we going to solve this issue? Because the threat actor, China, that's what they're leveraging, is the economic. And I don't know if we have a unified strategic approach to this in terms of, number one, our own nation, number two, North America, number three, NATO and our other allies.
So one of the elements in that, of course, is that we don't talk about it much. We're bringing this topic forward because it needs to be in the public mindset. You talk about wanting to be able to engage the general public and business. It has to happen here. It has to happen in other countries. We have to recognize what the threat is. Stephen, I noted that you had quoted Michel Foucault saying, "Knowledge is power." And we have to share these insights. So I thank all of you today for taking the time to join us from around the Indo-Pacific to help to raise awareness of the value, the strategic value, the economic value, and what we need to do to make sure that we can maintain a balance that is beneficial to all. I thank you for your time today, and we'll see you next week on the Security Disruptors.